The office was not supposed to be occupied. Orith knew this the way he knew the rotation schedules of every station in the Galactic Union's 47-system administration. Completely instinctively and without need for verification, he had arrived 7 minutes early, as he always did, because the Supreme Chancellor's day began before the day officially began, and the first moments of private silence in that high chamber room were the only moments in any given cycle that belonged entirely to him. The guards had swept the corridor 12 minutes prior. The biometric seal on the inner door had registered no entry since his departure the previous evening. And yet, when the door dilated open and the pale blue light of early cycle spilled across the curved floor, there was someone sitting in the chair across from his desk. Orith did not reach for any alarm. He did not call out. He stood in the doorway for a count of 3 breaths, studying the figure, and the figure sat with a kind of stillness that was not the stillness of patience or anxiety or tension, but the stillness of something that simply did not require movement in the way that living things require movement. It was present the way a mountain is present, not threatening, not demonstrating anything, simply there. The being's form was bipedal, roughly, though the proportions were subtly wrong in ways that Orith's mind kept sliding past without cataloging. Its surface, he could not think of his skin exactly, though it resembled skin, was a color of deep water lit from below, a shifting blue-green that changed as the ambient light moved. It had no visible eyes in conventional sense, but Orith had the absolute and unshakable certainty that it was watching him with complete attention. It wore nothing. It carried nothing. It simply sat, and the chair it sat in seemed somehow to fit it better than it had ever fit anyone else, which was strange because the chair had been custom fabricated to Orith's own body measurements 14 years ago. Chancellor Orith, it said. The voice came from everywhere in the room at once, gently, with none in particular directional quality of a voice emerging from a throat. It spoke in standard galactic without accent, without hesitation, without the microscopic pauses that indicated real-time translation. I apologize for the intrusion. I needed to speak with you before your day acquired too much momentum to allow for careful listening. Orith stepped fully into the room, the door sealed behind him. He walked to his desk, not because he felt in control of the situation, but because standing in the doorway conveyed nothing useful, and he had learned decades ago that the illusion of composure was often the precondition for composure itself. He settled into his chair. He looked at the being across the curved expanse of dark surface between them. You bypassed 7 independent security systems, Orith said, including 3 that are not on any public record of this building's architecture. Yes, the being said simply, and you're going to tell me how. No, the being said with the same pleasant simplicity. That is not what I came to tell you. What I came to tell you is considerably more important than the mechanics of how I arrived. I would ask you to listen without interruption until I have finished, not because interruption offends me, but because the information I carry is structured in a way that partial delivery makes it more frightening than complete delivery, and I have no interest in frightening you. Orith folded his hands on the desk. Outside the chamber's high windows, the capital city of Vera Station was coming alive in the early light. The transport threads weaving between the tower clusters, the market platforms extending their canopies, the ordinary gorgeous machinery of 47 civilizations existing in managed proximity to one another. He had spent 31 years managing that machinery. He had seen crises that should have broken the Union and watched them resolve through patience and intelligence and the sometimes maddening slowness of democratic process. He was not, by any definition he recognized, an easy person to alarm. Go ahead, he said. The being was quiet for a moment, not gathering itself or a thought, more like allowing a silence that it considered appropriate to exist before it did not. The galaxy you inhabit, the being said, is not natural. It was constructed. Every star you have cataloged, every planet your people have walked upon, every nebula that your poets have used as metaphor, every gravitational structure that your scientists have mapped and described and incorporated into your understanding of physical law, all of it was deliberately built. It was precisely arranged. The process began approximately 13 billion years ago as your calendar measures time, and it was completed to initial specification approximately 12.7 billion years ago, after which it was allowed to proceed according to the physical parameters its builders had encoded into its foundational structure. Orith said nothing. He had promised not to interrupt. He kept the promise through an act of will that he was not certain he could have managed 20 years ago. The civilization responsible for this construction, the being continued, existed before the galaxy you know existed. They were not from this galaxy. They were from a structure outside of it, a place for which you do not yet have adequate conceptual frameworks, which is not an insult to your intelligence, but simply a description of where your collective knowledge currently stands. They built this galaxy as a constructed environment. A habitat, perhaps, is a word that approximates a function, though the scale makes the word feel insufficient. They built it with precision that your current physics can partially detect, but not yet fully interpret. They seeded it with the conditions for the emergence of complex matter, of molecular structures, of what you call life. They did not design the specific life that would emerge. That was, for them, the point. They were interested in emergence, in what would develop inside the constructed environment over long spans of time. A transport thread passed beyond the high window, silent at this distance. Orith watched it without meaning to. They had been absent, the being said, for approximately 9 billion years. During their absence, everything you know has developed. Your 47 civilizations, the hundreds of others you have not yet contacted, all of the life, all of the culture, all of the history, all of the conflict and cooperation and discovery, it all occurred inside their construction, without their observation, in the period of their absence. I want to be precise about this. They did not watch. They were genuinely gone. What has grown here grew without their awareness, without their interference, and without their guidance. Everything your civilizations have achieved, they achieved on their own, inside a built environment, the same way that a garden grows on its own inside walls that someone else constructed. The being paused again. Orith had the sense that the pauses were calibrated, that this being understood the tempo at which difficult information could be absorbed. They are returning, the being said. They will arrive, in the measurement of time your union uses, in approximately 40 years. Their reason for returning at this particular moment is not something I am equipped to fully explain. Their motivations operate at a scale of intention that I can convey only approximately. What I can tell you is that they are returning with curiosity. They want to observe what has grown. They are aware, now that complexity has developed. They became aware of this at a distance, which is part of what prompted the return. They do not know the specifics of what they will find. Orith unclenched his hands and reclasped them. And what happens to what they find, he said, when they arrive? The being's surface shifted, that deep blue-green moving like deep water. That, it said, is genuinely uncertain. That uncertainty is why I am here. They are not, as best as I can translate their orientation, hostile. They are not, to use one of your civilization's frameworks, coming to reclaim property and evict its inhabitants. But they are also not committed to the inhabitants' continuation. They are curious, and what they find when they arrive, what the inhabitants of their construction have become and have chosen and have demonstrated about themselves in the 40 years between now and the arrival, that will matter. I cannot tell you precisely how it will matter, because the answer to that question involves a kind of deliberation I am not able to predict. What I can tell you is that 40 years is the time available, and I can tell you that it is not, by any measure I have access to, nothing. The silence after this was different from the silences that had preceded it. It was the silence of a room that had permanently changed. Who are you? Orith asked. I am something like an intermediary, the being said, a function that was built into the original construction for exactly this contingency. The contingency of development reaching a point where communication was warranted. You might think of me as a property manager, though I want to be careful not to let that metaphor carry too far, because property implies a relationship I am not certain accurately describes your situation. I am the mechanism by which this conversation is happening. I have no name because I was not named. I have no species because I am not a species. I am a function made into a form. Have you had this conversation before? Not in this galaxy, the being said. In others, yes. The two words sat in the air between them with the weight of everything they implied. Are you going to stay? Orith asked. I am available, the being said. I will not impose my presence. I will not answer every question. Many questions I genuinely cannot answer, and I will tell you so directly when that is the case, rather than providing comfortable fictions. I will be reachable if you need to reach me. I leave you now because what you need most immediately is not more information from me. What you need most immediately is time to think. It stood. The movement was fluid in a way that had no particular quality Orith could name. Not fast, not graceful in any familiar sense. Simply completely without the slight awkwardness that defined living motion, the tiny adjustments and rebalancings that all embodied things performed. It moved toward the door. "Wait," Orith said. It stopped. "The other galaxies." Orith said, "The ones where you've had this conversation before. What happened to them?" The being's surface moved. "Different things," it said, and then the door opened, though Orith had not triggered it, and the being walked through it. And the door closed, and Orith was alone in a room that had changed. He sat for 11 minutes without moving. Then he reached for his communications panel and began to make calls. Neva received the summons in the middle of an argument. The argument was about dark lattice distribution in the outer filaments of Cluster 7, and it was a kind of argument she enjoyed most. Specific, technical, conducted with people who knew enough to push back meaningfully. Her colleague Drescht had been maintaining for 6 months that the filament distribution showed evidence of an organizing principle that their current gravitational models could not account for. And Neva had been maintaining with equal conviction that the anomaly was instrumental rather than real, and they had been productively incorrect at each other for long enough that the debate had become one of the defining features of Collective's recent work. The summons came through on Priority Channel, which Neva almost never used, and the code attached to it was one she had never seen activated in 17 years as chief scientist. The Supreme Chancellor's direct request for immediate consultation, flag at the highest possible urgency level. Drescht saw her face change. "Go," he said, not dismissive, curious, and slightly concerned in a way that colleagues of long standing became concerned when something interrupts a pattern they depended on. She went. The transit from the Collective station to Vera took 9 hours, and Neva spent most of them reviewing everything she knew about situations that warranted the Chancellor's highest urgency summons. The list was not long. First contact with previously unknown civilization, the discovery of a weapon capable of system-scale destruction, a structural failure in the Union's life support infrastructure, a political crisis that threatened the membership of one or more of the 47. She could think of nothing currently active that fit any of those categories. The Galactic Union was in one of its periods of relative stability, a state that Neva privately found mildly tedious. Because science advanced fastest under the pressure problems that felt urgent, and relative stability had a way of making even fundamental research feel like catalog work. She had not been told what the summons was about. This itself was unusual. The protocols for top priority consultations typically included a briefing document delivered in transit. The absence of the briefing document was its own information. Orith met her himself at the transit port, which she had also never experienced. Supreme Chancellors did not meet people at transit ports. They received people in their offices or in formal meeting chambers or in the great councils where the business of 47 civilizations was negotiated with the painstaking care that 47 civilizations required. She had known Orith for 12 years, in the way that a senior scientific official knows the political structure she serves. Professionally, respectfully, occasionally with friction, always with the underlying understanding that their roles required different things of them. He was a politician in the deepest sense, someone whose intelligence ran in the direction of managing relationships among competing interests, someone who found the machinery of governance the same kind of satisfaction that Neva found the machinery of physics. She respected him. She had never seen him look like this. "Walk with me," he said. Not a formal command, almost a request. They walked through a corridor that a security team had cleared, and he told her everything the being had said, beginning to end, with the kind of precise recall that she had always associated with him at his best, leaving nothing out, adding nothing in, offering no interpretation as he went, just a clean delivery of what had been delivered to him. When he finished, she walked beside him in silence for a few steps, her mind doing the thing it always did with new information. Not reacting first, but laying it out, examining its structure, looking for its edges. "You want to know if it's true," she said. "I want to know everything that science can tell me about whether it's true, how true it is, and what the evidence looks like." Orith said, "I want the Myron Research Collective to become the Union's primary investigative body on this question." I want resources without limit. I want complete information security, which I will discuss with you in terms of how long we maintain it and when we begin wider disclosure. And I want your honest assessment. Always, not the assessment you think I need or the one that will be easiest for me to work with politically. You'll always have that, Neva said. I know, he said. That's why I called you first. She was quiet for another beat, and then she said, the dark lattice distribution anomaly. Orith looked at her. Dresch has been arguing for 6 months that the filament structure in Cluster 7 shows evidence of an organizing principle our gravitational models can't account for, she said. I've been telling him the anomaly is instrumental. If what this being told you is true, then Dresch is right and I'm wrong. And if Dresch is right about that, the same organizing principle is probably visible in dozens of other datasets that we've been explaining away or attributing to known causes. That's what I need to know, Aura said, whether the anomaly is everywhere. If the galaxy was constructed, Neva said slowly, working it through as she spoke, the construction would have to be visible. You cannot build something of this scale without leaving marks. The question is whether the marks look like natural physics or like engineering. And the way you'd tell the difference is whether the physical constants and structural parameters cluster at values that have a particular kind of precision, not just a precision of natural variation, but the precision of deliberate setting, like finding that every measurement of a room comes out to exactly a round number. It could be coincidence, but enough of them together stops being coincidence. Can you look for that? We've been looking at versions of that question for centuries, Neva said. We just haven't been looking at it with this as the hypothesis. She paused. The evidence might already be in our existing data. We might have been explaining it away because constructed universe wasn't in our hypothesis space. How long to know? Orith asked. Months, she said. Maybe a year, if we're being honest about the scale of the data review. Possibly 2 years before we have anything that would stand up to the scrutiny of the full scientific community. We have 40 years, Orith said. Use them well. Commander Sale received the news differently from anyone else who received it, which was partly a function of character and partly a function of position, and Sale had long ago stopped being able to tell where character ended and position began. The Outer Reach Defense Force existed to manage the boundary zones, the systems of the edge of Union space, where the mapped gave way to the unmapped, where first contact protocols were active concerns rather than theoretical exercises, where what happened when you encountered something new was a practical question with immediate consequences, rather than a philosophical one reserved for academic discussion. Sale had spent 22 years in the Reach, had commanded 3 of its 7 stations, and had overseen more genuine unknown contact situations than any other officer currently serving. She was not, by any measure, someone who defaulted to alarm. She had learned, through specific and sometimes costly experience, that alarm was a response she could not afford to indulge before she had information, because alarm in the absence of information had a way of creating the situations it was responding to. But she had also learned, through those same specific and costly experiences, that some situations were simply as serious as they appear to be, and that the discipline of not defaulting to alarm did not mean never reaching alarm. It meant reaching it accurately. She reached it accurately when she read Orith's briefing document. She read it 3 times. Then she called her executive officer, Tyron, who was the most methodical mind she had encountered in 2 decades of service, and she handed him the document, and she watched his face as he read it, and watched him read it again, and watched him look up at her with an expression that she recognized as the expression of someone whose discipline against alarm was being tested in exactly the same way hers had been tested. Your reaction? She said. The border implications are significant, he said carefully, which was Tyron at his most understated. The border implications, Sale said, are that every assumption we have made about what border means is potentially wrong. We are not a civilization living in a natural universe, managing the edges of our own territory. We are inhabitants of a constructed space that has an exterior. An exterior is where the builders are, and they're coming through. From which direction? Tyron said, which was such a precisely practical question that Sale almost laughed, and would have if the situation had permitted it. The being didn't specify, she said. Orith asked. It said it genuinely didn't know, or couldn't convey it in terms that would mean anything to us. The concept of direction that apply at the scale the builders are operating at don't map onto the concept of direction we use. Then we can't position defensively. No, she said, we cannot. She let that sit for a moment. The defense force had defensive postures for virtually everything. Known threat vectors, unknown threat vectors, contact situations that went wrong, catastrophic weapon deployment, cascading system failures. It did not have a posture for a situation in which the concept of defense was geometrically inapplicable. What does the Chancellor want from us? Tyron asked. He's not sure yet, Sale said. He wanted the force briefed at the senior level, confidentially, because it's need us to be thinking about this now rather than later. He said specifically that he does not want a military response in any conventional sense. He was emphatic about that. He said the being was clear that a show of force would be, and I'm quoting his document, not a relevant gesture in any direction. What does that mean? I think it means that the builders are so far beyond our military capability that demonstrating it would be like an insect showing its mandibles to us. Not a threat, not a provocation, just a piece of information about scale. She paused. I think what Orith needs from a force is something different. He needs us to think about the 47 civilizations' internal stability. What happens to society that learns its universe is constructed, whether the social fabric holds, whether there are factions that might respond in ways that make the situation worse, whether there are vulnerabilities the force needs to be monitoring. Internal security rather than external defense, Tyron said. The most important kind, Sale said. Because if 47 civilizations fall apart in the face of this information, we have nothing to present to the builders when they arrive. Whatever we present, whatever we are when they get here, it has to be something we built together over 40 years, not something we've torn apart. She looked out the observation port at the edge space that was her domain. The dark between the stars, the immense uncatalogued space where the Union's light ended and the unknown began. It looked different now. In a way she couldn't quite articulate. Not more threatening. Not less. Just different in its meaning. The border she had spent 22 years defending was not the edge of anything that mattered in the way she had understood it to matter. The real edge of things was somewhere she didn't have instruments to see. She did not find this comfortable. But comfort was not the measure she used for anything she had chosen to dedicate her career to, and she was not going to start now. Get the station commanders on a secure channel, she said. I want them briefed within the rotation, and I want a full behavioral analysis of every species in the outer reach, what stress indicators we'd expect to see, what the escalation patterns look like, what we should be watching for. If this information reaches the public before the Chancellor is ready to release it, I want to know within minutes. Understood, Tyron said and left. Sale stayed at the observation port for a long time, watching the dark between the stars that she now understood in a way she hadn't understood it this morning. She thought about the 40 years. She thought about what 40 years felt like from the inside of civilization. How much could change? How much could be built? How much could be lost? She had been born 42 years ago. 40 years ago, she had been a child in a school on a station she now commanded. Everything she had become in that time. Everything they had 40 years to decide. 3 months after Ortha's meeting with the nameless being, Neva stood in the primary data analysis chamber of the collective's new installation, expanded by a factor 12 with union funding that had arrived before she'd finished asking for it, and looked at the first results of what her team was calling internally, with grim humor, the Foundation's project. The results were unambiguous. That was the part she had not expected. She had prepared herself for the slow accumulation of equivocal evidence, for the kind of probabilistic argument that could be made in multiple directions, for the months of peer review and counter-analysis and careful qualification that characterized science done properly. She had prepared herself for uncertainty. She had not prepared herself for the data to simply be clear. Drescht had been right. The dark lattice distribution was not instrumental. It was structural. And once they had set that as their starting point and gone back through 30 years of accumulated observational data with new eyes, the organizing principle was everywhere, not as a mystery, but as a pattern that had been misidentified so consistently across so many independent research programs and institutional traditions that the misidentification itself was data. They had seen it and explained it away, over and over, Because constructed universe was not in the hypothesis space. The physical constants first. She called Orith on a secure channel with the results. The fundamental constants, she said, without preamble, sit at values that are statistically improbable under any natural formation model we have. Not improbable in the sense of unlikely but possible. Improbable in the sense that the probability space required to produce their specific combination by chance would have to be so vast that the natural formation model becomes effectively incoherent. How long have we known this? Orith said, "We've known the values for centuries," Neva said. "The problem is that when you live inside the only physical reality you know, you have nothing to compare it to. You can calculate that the constants are fine-tuned. We've done that. But you explain it with a sufficiently large multiverse, because that's the most conservative available explanation. The multiverse hypothesis says, there are enough universes that even the improbable constants will appear somewhere, and here we are. It's a completely reasonable inference from the data we had. But the multiverse explanation doesn't account for the spatial distribution," Neva said. "In a natural universe, even one with fine-tuned constants, the large-scale structure should show the signature of its initial conditions: turbulence, asymmetry, the specific kind of irregular regularity that natural processes produce. What we see instead is a structure that is precisely regular in ways that natural physics can produce in principle, but essentially never does in practice. The filament distribution, the cluster spacing, the distribution of galaxy types across the observable volume, all of it sits at values that are consistent with careful engineering rather than natural formation. Not impossible under natural formation, just vanishingly improbable. Can you put a number on it?" "I can," she said, "but the number is so large that it stops functioning as communication. At a certain point, improbability becomes certainty, and we are past that point." She paused. "There's something else." "Tell me." "The construction," she said, left a signature. "In the cosmic microwave background, the radiation that permeates the galaxy from its earliest period. It has anomalies that every cosmological tradition in the Union has documented, and none have fully explained. Tiny deviations from the smooth distribution that should characterize a natural early universe. We've been calling them primordial fluctuations and building models to account for them. They're not primordial fluctuations," Orith said. "Flat, certain. They are information," Neva said. "We don't know yet what the information says. We are working on it. But the pattern is not random, and it is not consistent with any natural process we can model. It is consistent with data intentionally encoded into the background radiation of a constructed system by whoever built the system. It could be a signature. It could be a record. It could be instructions. We don't know yet. We may not be able to decode it in 40 years. But it's there." The silence on the channel was long enough that Neva checked the connection. "Chancellor." "I'm here," Orith said. "I'm thinking." "The being was telling the truth," Neva said. "That's what the data says. All of it, across every domain we've examined. The galaxy is constructed. The construction is approximately 13 billion years old by our measurement. And the precision of it is," she paused, choosing the word carefully, "extraordinary. Whoever built this knew exactly what they were doing, at a level of precision that makes everything we've ever built look like a child's first attempt. And the life," Orith said, "the emergence of life, was that engineered?" "That's a harder question," she said. "The conditions for life were encoded. The constants, the stellar evolution parameters, the molecular interaction probabilities. Life was made possible with enormous precision, but the specific forms that emerged, whether we specifically were designed, the evidence doesn't support that. The design ended at the level of making it possible. What grew inside the possibility was genuinely emergent." She hesitated, which is consistent with what the being described. They were interested in emergence. They built the environment that made it possible and then let it develop on its own. "A garden," Orith said quietly. "Yes," she said. "Exactly that." The decision to go public was the hardest political calculation of Orith's life, and it made some that he would not easily forget. He spent 6 months consulting, through secure channels, with the heads of government of all 47 civilizations. Not all of them were willing to believe it initially. The Droshan Collective, a society whose founding philosophy centered on the principle that meaning was something civilizations made rather than found, that the universe was indifferent and its indifference was a liberation that made genuine choice possible, received the information with a stillness that Orith could not read, and that eventually resolved, after 3 weeks of silence, into something he could only call determination. The Veth Communion, deeply religious in a tradition that placed the galaxy itself as a manifestation of divine intention, received it as confirmation rather than crisis. Of course it was made. Everything sacred is made. The Pahari, whose civilization had been built on military distinction and the proud tradition of having survived 11 existential threats without external assistance, responded with a media hostility that gradually transformed over several months of conversation into something that Orth cautiously identified as motivation. But he could not keep it quiet forever, and he had not intended to. The question was when and how. Sale had been sending him detailed behavioral analyses every quarter from the Outer Reach, tracking the social stability indicators across dozens of civilizations. The reports were careful and thorough and deeply sobering. Social stability, she noted, was not something that held because people didn't know things. It was something that held because the things people knew were integrated into a coherent picture of who they were and what their existence meant. When a piece of information arrived that could not be integrated, that sat outside the existing picture and refused to fit, one of two things happened. Either the picture expanded to accommodate it, or the picture fractured. The difference between those two outcomes was not determined by the information itself, but by the context in which it arrived and the preparation that surrounded it. We need to release it, Sale told him at their 9th-month consultation, before it leaks. And it will leak. Information at this level does not stay contained indefinitely. If it leaks, we lose the ability to frame the context. If we release it, we control the framing. We also trigger the crisis. Aura said, we trigger the managed crisis versus the unmanaged one. Sale said, those are the options. There is no option where no crisis occurs. She was right. He had known she was right for 2 months. He had been waiting, partly for more scientific confirmation, partly for the stabilization protocols that his advisors had been developing, partly because every day of preparation was genuinely valuable. But there was a line beyond which preparation became avoidance, and he was close to it. He announced it in the full council of the Galactic Union, with all 47 heads of state or their direct representatives present, with the scientific summary Neva had prepared, with the full briefing document, and with the nameless being present in the room in a way that no one had expected and that settled, with absolute finality, the question of whether this was real. The being stood at the side of the chamber and said nothing during the presentation. It did not need to say anything. Its presence was a fact that could not be argued with, a fact of a different order than the facts in Neva's briefing document. Not data, but evidence of kind that superseded data. The council did not fracture. It also did not take the news well, in any unified sense. What happened in that chamber over the 8 hours that followed Ortha's presentation was the concentrated version of what happened across 47 civilizations over the following months. Disbelief, then grief, then anger in various directions, then the slow, painful reconfiguration of how to think about what they were and what it meant. The Droshan delegate stood up 3 hours into the session and said, with a quiet intensity that Orth would remember for the rest of his life, we have been asking the question of meaning for 10,000 years. This does not answer that question. It changes the question, but it does not answer it. We are still here. We are still choosing. Whatever built the container did not build the choices we have made inside it. Those are ours. It was not the only voice that mattered, but it was the one that landed. Neva did not sleep well for 2 years after the public announcement, which was unusual for her. She was not, by temperament, someone whose sleep was disturbed by intellectual difficulty. The laboratory life had inured her problems that had no immediate solution. The ability to hold an open question with equanimity was, she had always thought, one of the genuine skills that distinguished a working scientist from someone who merely wanted certainty dressed in scientific clothing. But this was different from an open question. This was a question about what she was, and more specifically, about what the work she had spent her life doing meant. She had been a scientist of the natural universe, and the natural universe had turned out to be an artifact. The physics she had spent decades investigating was not the physics of nature, but the physics of engineering. The physical constants were specifications. The large-scale structure was architecture. The cosmic background was a signature left by the builders. Every insight she had ever had was an insight into someone else's design. She worked through it the way she worked through everything, by going to the lab, by doing the science. Because whether the universe was natural or constructed, it was still the universe she lived in, and the phenomena were still real, and the understanding she developed still mattered in the specific practical sense that understanding always mattered. It allowed you to do things, to predict things, to navigate more capably through the reality you inhabited. And there was the cosmic background signal. She spent 18 months on it before she had anything that resembled a clear result, and another year after that confirming the result enough to be confident in it. And the result was, the signal was a record, not instructions, not a warning. A record of the construction process, an embedded account, in a language that was not a language in any conventional sense, but a structured pattern of information of what had been built and how it had been built, like an architect's complete documentation stored in the material of the building itself. They could not read most of it. The conceptual frameworks required to interpret the majority of the signal were simply not available yet. The science to decode what the builders had encoded was, in many places, science they had not yet developed. But the structure of the signal was itself informative. It was organized. It was internally consistent. It had been placed there deliberately, which meant the builders had anticipated that whoever developed inside the construction would, eventually, be able to look for it. She brought this to Orith at year 3. They left us a message, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Intentionally? Everything they did was intentional, she said. But yes, specifically, the signal is not just a signature. It's a document, a record of what this is and how it was made. We can't read most of it yet, but we can read enough to understand that it was meant to be found. By us, by whoever developed to the point of looking, she said. It doesn't seem to be addressed to a specific species or a civilization. It's addressed to whatever grew here to the point of being able to find it, which means they expected something to grow here to that point. Yes, she said, not this specifically, but something, and something capable of understanding that they'd left a record. She paused. There's an implication in that. Tell me. They weren't indifferent to what grew here. If they were indifferent, they wouldn't have left a record. Indifference doesn't leave messages for the people you don't care about. They were curious, invested in a way that doesn't translate easily, but that is distinct from indifference. They wanted whoever developed here to know what this was, at some point, before or after their return. Orith asked. I don't know, she said. The timing of the return and the timing of our ability to find the signal. I can't determine whether that's coincidence or design. It might be that the signal was always there, and we'd have found it eventually regardless. It might be that the return is precisely timed to occur after we'd reached the point of finding it. I can't tell. Orith was quiet. Either way, he said, we've found it, which means we know something about what we are that we might not have known if we hadn't looked. Yes, she said. And what we are, he said, slowly, is a civilization developed enough to read a 13-billion-year-old message from our builders, or at least to find it, and to understand that it was meant to be found. That's one way to put it, she said. Is it wrong? She thought about it seriously, the way she thought about everything. No, she said, it's not wrong. Sale's 22nd year in the Outer Reach was the most difficult of her career, and she had had some years in the Reach that had, by any objective measure, been extremely difficult. The difficulty was not external. The builders had not arrived early. There were no new threats from outside Union space, no contact situations gone wrong, no weapons deployed, no systems in crisis. The difficulty was internal, which was both exactly what she had anticipated and somehow harder than she had expected. The information about the constructed galaxy had moved through the 47 civilizations like a wave, and waves had a way of striking different surfaces differently. Some civilizations had integrated it with a speed and apparent ease that Sale privately did not entirely trust. Integration that quick often meant suppression rather than actual processing, and suppression tended to find expression in unexpected ways later. Others had struggled visibly, with the kind of public reckoning that produced difficult politics, but left people genuinely transformed by the encounter with the difficult truth. A few had done neither, and those were the ones that worried her most. Civilizations where the information had landed and nothing visible had changed, which in her experience meant that the change was happening somewhere she couldn't see. There were also factions. In any collection of 47 civilizations, there are always factions, but the revelation had produced new ones with new configurations of belief and grievance. The most significant, from the force of security perspective, was a coalition that had formed across species lines under the rough banner of what its members called sovereignty, the argument that the builders had forfeited any legitimate claim on the galaxy's current inhabitants by their 13-billion-year absence, and that whatever the builders were returning for, the appropriate response was not deference but assertion. We are here. This is ours now. The length of uncontested occupancy establishes a right that cannot be revoked by the return of a landlord who was absent longer than consciousness itself had existed. Sale understood the argument. She even, in certain lights, had sympathy for it. There was something genuinely important in the refusal to begin from a position of subordination, in the insistence that what had been built inside the construction belonged to those who had built it, not to whoever had built the container. But she had spent 22 years in the Reach, and she had developed a hard-won understanding of what happened when assertion without capability confronted a situation that required either genuine negotiation or genuine accommodation. The sovereignty faction was asserting a right they had no mechanism to enforce against beings who were returning to a galaxy they had constructed, and the assertion, however emotionally coherent, would not be received by the builders in the terms its proponents intended. She brought this to Orth in her reports. She also brought it to the faction leaders directly, in conversations that were among the most demanding of her career, conversations where she had to take the argument seriously enough to engage with it honestly, while also being clear about the strategic situation in a way that the argument's emotional force made it easy to resist hearing. I don't disagree with your values, she told Vaughn, the Polhari commander who had become the most visible voice of the sovereignty position, in a secure conversation in Year 11. What has been built here belongs to those who built it. The cultures, the histories, the knowledge, the relationships between species. Those are not the builder's property. They're ours. Then we should say so. Vaughn said, we will say so. Sale said, the question is how. Saying so from a position of demonstrated capacity and coherent self-knowledge is different from saying so from a position of reflexive defiance. The first makes us legible as something worth engaging with. The second makes us look like a system that hasn't integrated the information it's been given. You think we should be grateful, Vaughn said, and the tone carried years of accumulated frustration. No, Sale said, and she meant it. I think gratitude is not the relevant category. We didn't choose to be born in a constructed galaxy any more than we chose the specific star systems our ancestors came from. Gratitude to the builders would be strange and probably misdirected. But legibility is different from gratitude. Being legible as a civilization that understands its own situation and has thought carefully about what it is and what it values. That's not subordination. That's competence. Vaughn was quiet for a long moment. And if they're not interested in what we are, if they come back and we're simply in a way, then we find that out when they arrive, Sale said, and we face it as what we are, which is the only way we've ever faced anything. She paused. But I've spent 2 decades in the Reach, learning to read contact situations before they resolve. And the information we have, the message in the background, the fact that they left a message at all, the fact that they sent an intermediary to tell us they were coming rather than simply arriving, none of that reads like indifference. None of it reads like a civilization that considers us irrelevant. It reads like something, Vaughn said. Yes, Sale said. I don't know it yet. None of us do. But something. Year 15 arrived at a speed that Neva found disproportionate to what had been accomplished, which was a great deal, and to what remained uncertain, which was almost everything that mattered. The Foundation's project had produced, by year 15, the most significant body of scientific work in the history of the Galactic Union. Not significant in the comfortable sense of significant. Not the kind of significance that generated celebration and clear progress. Significant in the sense that it had fundamentally reorganized a conceptual framework through which every physical science in every civilization of the Union understood what was studying. The universe, the galaxy, was no longer a given. It was an artifact. And the science of understanding an artifact was subtly but importantly different from the science of understanding a given, because an artifact carried the intention of its maker, and intention was not something that natural physics accounted for. They had decoded more of the background signal. Not most of it. Not enough to say with confidence what the builders had intended beyond construction itself, but enough to understand several things that reorganized what she knew. The construction had taken what their calendar measured as approximately 300 million years. 300 million years of deliberate work, of placing stars and tuning planetary systems, and calibrating the molecular interaction probabilities that would lead, eventually, to matter organizing itself into complexity. The scale of intention behind it was something she had stopped trying to fully grasp, because fully grasping it was not available to her, and straining toward it was simply not productive. She worked, instead, with what was accessible, the specific and concrete evidence of what had been done, layer by layer. The builders were not a species in any sense of biology could encompass. The signal suggested, and this was the most tentative, most carefully qualified, most hedged finding in the entire Foundation's project, that the builders had, by the time they undertook the construction, undergone a transformation away from individual embodied consciousness towards something that she had no accurate word for, that the signal's pattern suggested was more like a distributed coherence than a collection of individuals, that operated at a scale that made the word civilization inadequate in both directions, too small and too simple. We are built by something that is no longer what it was when it built us, she told Orith at year 15, which is potentially the most important thing to understand about what we're going to be meeting. We are not meeting the civilization that built this galaxy. We are meeting what that civilization has become in 13 billion years. We have no idea what that means. The being, Orith said, it was built into the construction. It has existed for 13 billion years. Can it tell us? I've spent considerable time asking it, Neva said. It's cooperative. It's not evasive. But it consistently says that describing what the builders currently are is beyond its ability. Not because it's withholding, but because it doesn't have a conceptual apparatus either. It was built to be an intermediary, to manage the communication between whatever developed inside the construction and the builders when they returned. Its knowledge of the builders is structured around that function. What they are beyond that function, it can't say. Then we're approaching a meeting, Orith said, with something we have no framework to understand. Yes, she said, which is also, I want to note, not entirely without precedent. First contact with the Veth, 40 years before I was born, involved approaching a civilization that was so structurally different from anything the Union had encountered that the existing frameworks were inadequate. They developed new ones. The meeting happened. It didn't go perfectly, but it went. The Veth, Orith said, were a civilization of comparable scale to ours. Yes, she said. This is not that, but the principle of approaching genuine difference with genuinely open frameworks rather than inadequate existing ones is the same principle. We don't have a framework for what we're meeting. We need to arrive at the meeting without pretending we do, and with the genuine intellectual flexibility to develop one in real time. That's what we'll tell the Union, he said. That's what we should tell the Union, she said. Whether we can also do it. That's the thing I genuinely don't know. The sovereignty faction did not dissolve. Orith had not expected it to. He had expected it to evolve, and it did. Over 15 years of the most intensive internal political process the Union had ever conducted, the faction's position moved from reflexive defiance towards something more nuanced and, in Orith's judgment, more genuinely useful. The core argument shifted from assertion of rights the Union had no capacity to enforce to something he found considerably more defensible, the argument that the Union's response to the builders should be made from a position of genuine self-possession, not deference. That whatever the builders were curious about, the most honest and therefore most productive thing the Union could present was itself as it actually was, not as a performance of what it imagined the builders wanted to see. That was an argument Orith could work with. It was, in fact, an argument he had been developing independently from the other direction. Not that they should assert themselves, but that they should be themselves fully and without apology, and trust that being genuinely what they were was more likely to be valuable to whatever the builders were curious about them performing a managed version of themselves designed to maximize the probability of favorable reception. He had one more conversation with the nameless being before the arrival, at year 37, seeking confirmation that this approach was reasonable. The being sat in what had become, over 3 decades, its informal location in the Union's administrative complex, a room that had been given over to it without formality, that it occupied sometimes and was absent from at unpredictable intervals. Orith had learned that it did not experience time the way the rest of them experienced time. It was, in a very real sense, outside the 40-year urgency that organized everything the Union was doing. It would still be there after, whatever after looked like. We intend to present ourselves as we are, Orith said, with full knowledge of what we are, with the scientific understanding we've developed of construction, the message in the background, the evidence of the builders' methods and intentions as we've been able to decode it, and with a complete account of what the Union has been and has done and has chosen in the 13 billion years since, which is a time scale we now understand ourselves to occupy, even if we were only aware of a vanishingly small portion of it. That seems appropriate, the being said. Will it be enough? Orith asked. The being's surface moved in a way he had come to understand as the equivalent of a considered pause. I don't know what enough means in the terms you're asking, it said. What the builders will respond to is not something I can predict precisely. What I can tell you is that authenticity and self-knowledge are not qualities that have ever, in any system I have knowledge of, been irrelevant to how a contact situation resolves. That is not exactly reassurance. Orith said. No, the being said. It isn't. But I don't think you need reassurance from me. I think you need confidence in what you've built over these 40 years, and that confidence is something only you can have. What have we built? Orith asked. Not a genuine question, more a way of speaking aloud what he'd been thinking privately. I have watched, the being said. 47 civilizations receive information that destroyed the foundational assumptions of their existence and choose, rather than fracturing, to integrate it, to build a new understanding from the wreckage of the old one, to continue doing science, continue making culture, continue caring for one another across the borders that still produce difficulty. You've had crises, you've had factions, you've had civilizations that struggled and civilizations that adapted with more ease and civilizations that are still in the middle of their own specific process of reckoning. None of that is failure. All of it is what genuine integration looks like. It is not clean. It is not finished. It is real. Orith looked at the being for a long moment. You've watched us for 13 billion years. Not continuously, it said. My experience of time is genuinely different from yours. But yes, in a relevant sense. And in those 13 billion years, Orith said, are we remarkable? The being was quiet for a count that Orith did not try to measure. You are remarkable, it said, in the specific way that everything that grows is remarkable, in that you did not have to. The conditions for life existed. The conditions for complex life existed. The conditions for intelligence and civilization and culture existed. But none of those conditions require that you specifically develop from them, or that you develop the specific things you developed, the art and the governance and the science and the ways of being together across difference that are genuinely your own. The galaxy could have produced 1,000 other outcomes from the same initial conditions, and it produced you, and you chose what you chose, and that is not nothing. That is, to whatever approximation I have access to, the point. Orith held that for a moment. I'll tell that to the council, he said. I think you should, the being said. Sail was at the Outer Reaches primary observation station in year 40, hour 11, when the sensors began returning data that was unlike any data they had returned in the entire 26 years she had commanded the station. It was not that the data showed something new in the conventional sense, a new object, a new signal, a new contact. It was that the data began to show something in every direction simultaneously, which was not a category thing that any instrument in the Defense Force's entire network had been designed to detect, because the category had not previously existed. The builders were not arriving from a direction. They were arriving through the fabric of the space they had built, which was different from arriving through space, in the same way that a thread being pushed through cloth on the other side was different from something crossing the surface of the cloth. The instruments were catching the signature of the passage before the passage was complete. All stations, Sale said, her voice steady in a way it was steadiest under the heaviest pressure, the voice of 26 years of command making itself felt. We are detecting arrival signature. Relay to Union Command. Relay to Collective. Begin the pre-briefed acknowledgement protocols. All personnel to awareness stations. This is not a defensive posture. I want that clear on the record and on every channel. This is an awareness posture. We are witnessing. We are recording. We are not responding with any defensive capability. Is that understood? It was understood. Every voice that came back to her was steady. Her crew was good. The crews across the reach were good. They had spent 40 years preparing for exactly this awareness. The readiness not to fight, but to witness with full attention and full presence, which was its own kind of discipline. The arrival did not look like anything she had a language for. It looked, first, like a change in the quality of the space itself, a change that the instruments reported, and that she felt in some way that bypassed her instruments entirely, the way that certain profound events are felt in the body before the mind has processed them. Then it looked like light, but light that was not radiating from a source so much as light that was a presence itself, manifesting through a medium that was a constructed space of the galaxy they all lived in. Then it looked like nothing she could record, because the recording instruments began returning data that was outside their calibration range in ways that were not the usual ways of outside calibration range, not too much or too little, but categorically unlike. "They're here," she said, very quietly, to no one in particular. She was right. They were here. Orith received the signal from Sale Station and walked to the council chamber, where the full delegations of all 47 civilizations had been assembled for the past 3 days in continuous session, because no one had been able to determine in advance exactly when arrival would occur, and no one had been willing to not be present. The nameless being was in the chamber. It had moved to the center of the floor, which no one had asked it to do, which simply seemed right in a way that certain things simply seem right. And it stood there with its characteristic stillness, and its surface moving in the deep waterway, and its presence filling the room with the quality of something ancient and patient that had arrived at the moment it had been built for. "They are here," Orith said to council, and everyone in the chamber already knew, because the same feeling had moved through the station simultaneously. The feeling of something large becoming present that was not large in any spatial sense, but large in the sense of significance, of the quality of what was present. The communication, when it came, did not come through any channel the Union systems were equipped to receive. It came through the nameless being, which became, in that moment, transparently what it had always been. Not a messenger who carried messages, but a medium through which communication occurred, a function becoming visible. Its surface went from deep water blue-green to something else entirely, something that had no color in any wavelength Orith had instruments for, and it spoke in a voice that came from everywhere in the room at once, but the voice was now carrying something other than its own thoughts. The builders were, it seemed, and this was a word that came to Orith most naturally, without his choosing it, delighted. The communication was not words. Words came through the being's function as intermediary, afterward, an approximation, the being translating something that was not language into language with a consistent warning that language was inadequate but was the best available approach. What came through first, before translation, was equality, the quality of the builders' attention as they arrived and turned their awareness to the galaxy they had constructed 13 billion years ago and found this, the specific this of 47 civilizations, for 100 others not yet contacted, thousands of distinct cultural traditions, centuries of science and art and conflict and cooperation, and music and mathematics and medicine and agriculture and architecture, and all the specific ways that living things had found to be alive in the 13 billion years that the conditions for aliveness had been available. It felt like being recognized, not evaluated, not assessed, recognized in the way that a being with genuine curiosity recognizes something that has surprised and interested it. "They want to know what we know," the being said, speaking now as itself but carrying the communication through itself. Not in the sense of what information we have accumulated, in the sense of what understanding we have developed. They are asking, and this is an imperfect translation, what it is to be what we are. They were curious whether anything would develop. They find that something has developed that they did not fully anticipate. They find this, The being paused, and its surface moved in a way Orith had not seen before. Good. The word is imprecise, but it is the closest available. The council chamber was the quietest it had ever been. 47 civilizations worth of representatives, each with their own history and their own specific reckoning with what had been revealed and what they had become in 40 years of living with it. And the silence was the silence of people who were not performing composure, but actually had it. Not because nothing was happening, but because something so significant was happening that there was nothing to do but be present. Orith stood at the center of the chamber. He had prepared remarks. He had prepared them carefully over months, with the input of the full council and the scientific advisors, and Sales Behavioral Analysis team, and the 47 heads of state, and the being itself, as much as the being could advise. He set them aside. He spoke instead from the specific weight of 40 years, which was all he had, and which was he had decided in the 37th year, when the being told him it was a point. Exactly enough. We did not know what we were, he said. We did not know that we were inside something built, that we were living in an environment constructed with precision before we existed. We had evidence, your message in the background, the patterns and structure, the constants that did not sit at accidental values. And we had explained away, because the true explanation was not in our hypothesis space. When we were given the information, it changed everything we thought we knew, and what we did with that change, what these 47 civilizations did together in the 40 years since, is what we are. We are not what we believed ourselves to be before the information arrived. We are what we chose to become after it. We are the result of taking a truth that should have broken us and not breaking. We are the science we did when we knew what we were investigating. We are the conversations we had when we could no longer pretend the foundational questions had simple answers. We are the disagreements we had about what we owed one another and what we owed the builders and what we owed the truth. We are the work we chose to keep doing, not because the universe was natural and therefore ours by default, but because we were here and capable of it, and the capacity to do good work did not become less real when we learned we were inside a construction. He paused. The being's surface moved. We are aware, Aura said, that we cannot know whether we have used these 40 years as we should have. We have not used them perfectly. We have had factions and crises and civilizations that are still in the middle of their own specific reckoning. We have not solved the problems we came into these 40 years with. Some of us have died, and what they would have contributed to this moment we will never know. But we are here, all 47, not fractured, not performing unity, genuinely in the middle of the hard work of being many different kinds of people in a single constructed space, which is the only kind of unity that means anything. And if that is worth something to whatever you were curious about when you built this and let it develop, we offer it freely because it is ours to give. The being was quiet for a moment that felt different from the pauses that characterized its ordinary communication. Then it said, "They understand. They find it," the pause again, "sufficient, more than sufficient. They find," and here the being's surface moved in a way Orith had never seen, a way that made him think later that what he was watching was the being itself experiencing something beyond its ordinary function, that what has grown here is precisely what they hoped might grow somewhere over long enough time. They did not know it would be here. They have found it here. They are, pause, grateful. The silence after that word was the longest in the history of the council chamber. Neva was not in the chamber. She was at the collective's installation, with her instruments running, because if the builders were going to be present, she was not going to miss the scientific opportunity. And she had also long ago come to terms with the fact that her most genuine contribution to any significant moment in the history of the Union was not the performance of appropriate emotion in the appropriate setting, but the doing of the science that allowed the appropriate emotions to be grounded in actual understanding. Her instruments returned data that was like nothing her instruments had ever returned. She did not try in the moment to fully analyze it. She recorded everything. That was enough. The analysis was for the years that followed. But she watched the data come in, and she understood several things from the shape of it, even without analysis. She understood that the builders were not the civilization that had built this galaxy in the sense that she was a member of the civilization that had built the collective's current installation. They were continuous with that civilization the way that water is continuous with ice, which is to say, The same matter, organized by different conditions into something that behaves according to different principles. Whatever had built this galaxy 13 billion years ago had become, over that 13 billion years, something that operated outside the categories she used to think about what existed, not beyond her understanding in the sense of being too complex, beyond her understanding in the sense of being in a different category of existence, the same way that a planet is not a very complex molecule, but a different kind of thing entirely. She understood that they were not threatening. The signal had no aggressive structure. It had the structure, and this was the most unexpected thing. The finding that she would spend the next decade working to characterize properly of attention, of genuine, interested attention, of something very large looking at something much smaller with the quality of attention she associated with her best work. Not instrumental, not evaluative, not seeking to confirm or refute a prior judgment, but genuinely curious, open, ready to find that what it found was not what it had expected. She understood that they were going to leave, not immediately. The arrival had a quality that suggested settling, presence, the beginning of an extended contact rather than a brief visit. But the signal also had a quality, harder to describe, something in the structure rather than the content, of transience, of something that passes through rather than stays, of the difference between the tide coming in and the ocean being there. They were visitors in the galaxy they had built. The galaxy belonged to whoever had grown in it. They were going to stay long enough to know what they'd found, and then they were going to leave it to what they'd found. She understood that she would spend the rest of her life working on what the instruments had recorded in this moment, and that the work would outlast her, and that the civilization that continued after her would be working on something that would restructure every science in every civilization of the Union in ways none of them could currently predict. And she found, sitting with that understanding, that it did not produce the vertigo she had felt in the early months after the revelation. It produced something else, something that resembled, as closely as anything in her experience resembled it, the feeling she had always associated with the best moments in the laboratory, the feeling of standing at the edge of what was known and finding that the unknown was larger and stranger and more interesting than she had imagined, and having the tools to begin and having the time to do it. Sale watched from the outer reach as the builder's presence moved to the galaxy they had built, which took not the hours or days that conventional travel through the galaxy took, but something that her instruments registered as a duration while refusing to register as a distance. They moved without moving, in the sense that their movement was not the passage through space that defined movement for everything else she had ever tracked with her sensors. They were the water, and the space was a medium, and the passage was not the water moving to the medium, but the medium reflecting the water's presence. She had prepared reports. She had prepared assessments and analyses and contingency protocols for every scenario her imagination and her team's collective imagination had been able to produce. She filed them dutifully, because the recording of what happened was not a trivial responsibility, and she took it seriously. But she watched mostly without annotation. Some things required witnesses before they required analysts. The sovereignty faction, and she had been monitoring them carefully, was, in this moment, quiet, not converted, not dissolved. Quiet in the way that people are quiet when the thing they've been arguing about is happening, and the argument has given way to the experience. And the experience is larger than any argument had been. Vaughn sent her a one-line communication through a secure channel that read, "I understand now why you said what you said." No context. She did not need context. She sent back, "So do I?" What she understood was something she had been approaching for 40 years, but had not quite arrived at until this moment. That the question of what they were and what they owed to the builders and what the builders owed to them was not a question that had a fixed answer, because it was a living question, the kind that changes as the entities asking it change. 40 years ago, the Union had been 47 civilizations that believed themselves to be inhabitants of a natural universe with no exterior and no builders and no purpose beyond what they made for themselves. They were now 47 civilizations that knew themselves to be inhabitants of a constructed universe with an exterior that had now opened, and builders who had returned and found them. The word the being had used, good, sufficient, more than sufficient. What they were after that encounter was neither what they had been before nor what the encounter had tried to make them. They were something that had happened between the two, the specific result of meeting something vastly larger and older than themselves and remaining afterward themselves. Change, yes. Everything that lived changed when it encountered something large enough, but continuous with what they had been, not destroyed by the encounter, not transformed into something unrecognizable. Themselves knowing more. She found, in this, something she had not expected to find, a kind of peace with the border. She had spent 26 years managing the edge of known space, the place where the map ended and the unknown began. She had always understood the border as a practical problem and a source of genuine operational risk. She now understood it as something else, as a condition of being a living thing, the permanent fact that at the edge of everything you know, there is something you don't yet know, and the practice of your life is what you do at that edge, not eliminating the border, not pretending it isn't there, going to it every day and doing the work of managing it with care. The builders had not eliminated the border. They had changed what was on the other side of it, and they had shown that the other side was not hostile, and they had then, slowly, over the weeks and months that followed the initial contact, they had left, not immediately. The contact extended for 2 years, a period during which the being served as intermediary for exchanges that could not have been imagined 40 years earlier, communications that stretched the Union's scientific and philosophical frameworks to their limits and produced, in the process, the foundations of what will become the next century of intellectual work for every civilization in the Union. And then they left. They went back to the fabric of the space they had built, and the space closed behind them without a seam, and the instruments returned to normal ranges, and the galaxy was as it had always been, except that everyone in it now knew what it was and knew that its builders had found what had grown in it, and found it worth returning to see. Neva gave the address to the full council at year 42, 2 years after departure, at the first full gathering since the contact period had ended. It was the address she had spent 2 years writing and rewriting, because she was not a natural political speaker, and she was aware that what she wanted to say was not what a chief scientist address to the council was supposed to contain, and she had decided, somewhere in the second year, that she didn't care. We were asked, she said, in the background signal, in the record the builders left in the fabric of what they built, we were asked, in a language we are still learning to read, what we would make of what we were given, not as a test with a fixed answer, as a genuine question, left for whoever developed the capacity to find it. What will you make of this? What will you grow in the conditions we have built for growth? We have been answering that question for 13 billion years, without knowing the question was there. We have been growing the garden that was built for us, not because we were told to grow, but because living things grow when conditions exist. We have built civilizations and destroyed them and built them again. We have reached out across the spaces between stars and found others reaching back. We have made art from the available materials of consciousness and mathematics from the available structures of the universe we live in, and medicine from the available processes of the bodies we inhabit. We have been wrong about important things and slowly, painfully right about them afterward. We have cared for one another and failed to care for one another and cared again. The builders found this. They came back and looked at what had grown in conditions they had constructed, and they found. We know this now, from 2 years of the most careful analysis my team has ever done to records of the contact. They found something they described, in the closest translation available, as unexpected flowering. Not because they expected nothing, because what they built created the conditions for one kind of flowering, and what actually grew, in the specific form it took across these specific civilizations and their specific histories, was a different kind of flowering that they could not have designed or predicted. It was genuinely emergent, genuinely ours. I have spent my career studying the universe, and I now know that the universe is construction, and what I study is the artistry of its builders together with the ongoing emergent reality of everything that has grown inside it. I do not find this diminishing. I find it the most extraordinary thing I have ever considered. We are not less because we live in a built environment. The seed is not less because it grows in soil. The soil and the seed are both real, and the flower is both entirely determined by their properties and entirely unpredicted by either of them alone. We have 40 years of science from the Foundation's project that has already produced frameworks we will spend a century integrating. We have 2 years of contact data from a period of communication with the most advanced form of intelligence ever documented, which will take longer than a century to integrate. We have the beings we have become, having walked through the knowledge of what we are and where we are and having remained here, together, 47, arguing, working, building, disagreeing, caring. The same work as before, but now knowing what the work is and what it is for, and who built the ground it stands on, and who has come to see it and found it good. I am a scientist. The work does not stop. It has never been more necessary, and it has never been more interesting, and I intend to spend the rest of my available time doing it, and I suggest we all do the same. She sat down. The chamber was quiet for a moment. Then the applause began. Not the formal, structured applause of a political body marking completion of an address, the kind that starts before anyone decides to start it. Ortha's last official act as Supreme Chancellor, 11 years after the contact period ended, was a formal establishment of the Continuity Commission, whose purpose was to ensure that the knowledge, the records, the scientific findings, the contact data, and the complete history of the 40 years, from a morning a nameless being sat in his chair until the day the builders departed to the fabric of the galaxy they had built, would be preserved, communicated, and integrated across all 47 civilizations and all those who would join the Union in the centuries to come. He gave a brief address at the Commission's first formal session. He was older than he had been when this began, in the way that everything alive ages, and he had spent 53 years managing the machinery of 47 civilizations in managed proximity, and he was ready, genuinely ready, to let someone else manage it. But he had one thing to say first. I met a being once, he said, that was built into the construction of this galaxy 13 billion years ago for the specific purpose of telling us what it told us. It was not a person in the way we use that word. It was a function. It has told me that it will not be destroyed when its function is complete, that its nature is not subject to the same conditions as ours, that it will persist in the galaxy it has always inhabited. And I have asked it what it will do, now that the function it was built for has been performed. It said, observe. It said it will observe what continues to grow, because observation is what it was built to do, and because what continues to grow is genuinely interesting, and because there is no indication, in anything the builders communicated during the contact period, that the interest is over. It said, and I want to record this precisely, the builders did not leave because they were finished with what they found. They left because what they found is still growing, and growing things require the conditions for growth, and their presence changes those conditions. They will return. Whether in your measurement of time that return occurs in a century or a million years, I cannot say. But the flowering they found was not the end of the garden. It was a moment in the garden's ongoing life. He paused. The commission members waited. We have 47 civilizations, he said. Some of them have been members of the Union for over 400 years. Some joined in my tenure. There are hundreds of civilizations we have not yet made contact with, civilizations that do not yet know what they are, that are living inside the same constructed galaxy without the information the Union now carries. In the years ahead, as the Union expands its reach and its contact programs, we will tell them, one by one. We will sit with them the way I sat on that morning when the information arrived, and we will give them what was given to us, and they will have what we had, the crisis and the reckoning and the work of becoming something that could integrate the truth. That is the work we will do with what we have been given. That is how we will honor the 40 years, not by forgetting them or treating them as concluded, but by carrying what they taught us into every contact that follows, into every new civilization that joins us, into every future generation that will be born into a union that knows what it inhabits and is not afraid of that knowledge. We live in a built universe. We are alive inside something constructed with enormous care by something vastly older and larger than ourselves. And we are, despite all of that, genuinely and specifically ourselves, the unexpected flowering, the emergent result, the thing that grew in conditions provided and became, through its own choices and its own history, something that was not designed. We are what we are. We know it now. We can choose, with that knowledge, to keep being it. I think we should. He stepped back from the platform. Someone else came forward to take the session's business into the new era. The work continued. In the corner of the chamber, a being with no name and no species sat quietly, watching, its surface moving away of deep water lit from below, as it had sat and watched for 13 billion years, and would sit and watch for as long as there was something worth watching, which, by every indication, had access to, was going to be a very long time. This story was brought to you by HSY Stories. Subscribe to our channel and be the first to experience every new story.